sleeps.
Welcome, my fellow fear enthusiasts. Tonight I have another terrifying tale for you. The air in the hallway outside the laughing room is not merely cold. It is viscous. It clings to the skin like stagnant water, heavy with the metallic tang of old copper and ozone. Elias's hand trembles as he holds the flashlight, its beam cutting a frantic, jittery path through the encroaching gloom. The rhythmic sound, that hollow, percussive laughter, has shifted from a distant curiosity to a physical vibration in his marrow. He stops before the heavy, reinforced steel door of the room, labeled with a chipped, hand-painted sign that says simply, "Observation restricted." This ward has been sealed since the fire of 1954. There are no power lines, no ventilation, and by all laws of human biology, no occupants. Yet the laughter persists. It is not the sound of genuine mirth. It is a wet, mechanical wheezing, a chorus of voices layered over one another in a discordant harmony that suggests the speakers are lacking lungs. Elias pushes the door. It doesn't creak. It glides open with a silent, unnatural fluidity, as if the hinges had been oiled with something thicker than grease. The room is dark except for the pale, sickly moonlight filtering through reinforced glass that is somehow crusted with frost on the inside. His light sweeps the interior. 6 chairs are arranged in a perfect semicircle, facing the center of the room. They are antique wooden things, scarred with deep gouges, as if from frantic fingernails. They are shifting, not falling, not being pushed by a draft. They are adjusting themselves, inching across the cracked linoleum floor in short, jerky movements, like legs of a spider seeking a better vantage point. The scraping sound, the wood against the floor, matches the rhythm of the laughter perfectly. Elias enters, his scientific mind screaming for a mechanism, a hidden motor, a prankster with a winch, but his eyes refuse to provide a rational alternative. He approaches the center chair. As he draws near, the laughter abruptly cuts to silence, leaving behind a ringing in his ears so profound he tastes blood on his tongue. "Who's there?" Elias asks. His voice is a thin, reedy thing, swallowed instantly by the hungry acoustics of the room. No one answers, but the shadows beneath the chairs begin to stretch, detaching themselves from the furniture. They pool on the floor, deepening into a viscous, oily blackness that rises against the walls like a tide. He swings the flashlight around, his breathing ragged. His pulse is a jackhammer against his ribs. He catches sight of his own reflection in a cracked mirror, hanging on the far wall, a relic of the ward's former life as a recreational therapy space. In the mirror, he looks gaunt, his lab coat stained with a grime that hadn't been there when he woke up this morning. He looks like a man who has been living in these halls for years, not days. He turns back to the chairs. One of them is now directly in his path, blocking the exit. Clack! The chair tilts forward, its front legs slamming onto the floor. "I am Dr. Elias Vance," he says, his voice rising, a desperate, crumbling attempt to reassert his authority. "I am a medical professional. This is a sensory hallucination induced by environmental stress or chemical exposure in the HVAC system." The room laughs back, a singular, unified sound that feels less like a noise and more like an intellectual assault. It doesn't come from the chairs, it comes from the walls, from the very ceiling, from the marrow of his own bones. The room isn't just a place, it is a digestion chamber, and he is the latest arrival. He drops the flashlight. It doesn't shatter, it rolls, the beam spinning across the floor until it stops, pointing directly at the space beneath the chairs. There, etched into the floorboards in thousands of tiny overlapping scratches, are names of the staff who walked these halls decades ago, names of the patients who never checked out. He sees the name Alistair Thorne repeated in a jagged circular pattern, the letters carved so deeply they have bitten into the foundation of the building. Elias kneels, his fingers hovering over the wood. He feels a pulse beneath the floorboards, a slow, rhythmic thrumming that matches the cadence of his own heart. The air grows thicker, the pressure in the room increasing until he feels his eardrums strain. The shadows are no longer on the floor. They are rising, swirling in the air around him like ink dropped into a glass of water. He tries to stand, but his knees are heavy, anchored by a sudden overwhelming lethargy. He looks at the mirror again. The reflection of the room is different now. The chairs aren't empty. They are filled with pale, translucent figures. Their features blurred, their mouths hanging open in that same wet, wheezing rhythm. And there, in the center chair, the one he had stood before, sits a figure in a familiar, crisp white coat. It is himself. The version of Elias in the mirror isn't struggling. He isn't sweating or shaking. He is sitting perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, a faint, serene, and terrifyingly knowing smile playing on his lips. His eyes are wide, glassy, and completely empty of the spark of inquiry that had driven him to enter the ward in the first place. "No," Elias whispers, clutching his head. "That's not me. That's a projection. A trick of the light." The reflection doesn't mirror his movement. The reflection remains motionless, staring back at him with a predatory patience. He feels a cold hand, or the sensation of a cold hand settle on his shoulder. It isn't a physical touch. It's a violation of his personal space that feels like his skin is being peeled away. The silence of the room is now heavier than the laughter ever was. It is the silence of a tomb, the silence of a clock that has finally stopped ticking because it has run out of time to measure. He tries to bolt for the door, but the floor feels soft, pliable, like wet sand. He stumbles, falling to his knees. The floorboards groan, not with the weight of a man, but with the relief of a host finally absorbing its guest. "Welcome," a voice whispers. It doesn't come from behind him. It comes from inside his own throat, articulated by his own vocal cords, even though he didn't initiate the speech. Elias gasps, grabbing his own throat, but his hands feel like they belong to someone else. He looks up at the mirror one last time. The version of him in the glass is standing now, walking toward the frame of the mirror, his hand reaching out to touch the surface. Elias raises his own hand to meet the glass. Their fingers touch. The glass ripples like water. There is no barrier left. The distinction between the observer and the observed, between the doctor and the patient, between the man and the asylum, has ceased to exist. He feels his memories, his medical degree, his home in the city, the name of his mother, the crisp logic of his scientific worldview start to dissolve, washing away like salt in a rainstorm. He tries to scream, but the sound that emerges is the wet, mechanical wheeze of the laughing room. The glass wasn't reflecting the room. It was reflecting a graveyard. Long fingers, white-knuckled and trembling, traced the contours of the cold mirror frame. The laughter that had drawn me here, that dissonant, wet, rhythmic wheezing, didn't come from the hallway anymore. It was leaking from the silvered surface itself, a chorus of voices I recognized but couldn't name. "Don't look. Don't look, Elias. Just turn back to the corridor." The scientific mandate I had clung to for weeks. The idea that Blackwood was merely a crucible of sensory deprivation and mass hysteria dissolved like salt in a storm. I looked into the glass, and I saw them. The patients were not seated in the chairs. They were hanging from the ceiling, their limbs elongated and fused into the architecture of the ward, their mouths wide, silent O's that spilled sound into the room. They weren't just ghosts. They were architectural features. They were the wallpaper, the floorboards, the very dust motes dancing in the sickly light. And then there was me. In the center of the mirror, behind the shimmering veil of the glass, stood a version of myself. He was wearing my coat, my stethoscope draped loosely over his chest, but his eyes were not eyes. They were obsidian voids, flickering with the same stagnant, predatory calm I had seen in Dr. Thorne. He leaned forward, matching my movement, pressing his palm against the glass from the other side. His skin looked like parchment stretched over rot. Diagnosis. The voice didn't come from my lips. It came from the walls, vibrating in my teeth. Subject exhibits total cognitive dissolution. Treatment plan, integration. I tried to scream, but my lungs filled with the scent of ozone and wet earth. I reached for my medical kit, for the pen, for anything solid, but my hands had begun to blur. They were flickering, turning translucent, my fingernails shimmering with the same ghostly hue as the phantom patients behind me. I wasn't observing the ward anymore. I was becoming an observation of the ward. No, I gasped, the word tasting like copper. "I am Dr. Elias Vance. I have records. I have a history." The figure in the mirror smiled. It wasn't a smile of malice, but of profound, terrible completion. He tapped the glass, and a hairline fracture bloomed outward, spiderwebbing across the reflection. As the cracks spread, the reality of the room behind me began to liquefy. The floorboards turned to soft gray sludge, pulling at the soles of my shoes, dragging me downward into the sub-basement of my own psyche. I clawed at the air, but the air felt like velvet, thick, suffocating, and heavy with the history of 10,000 abandoned thoughts. I saw Nurse Shaw standing in the doorway of the reflection, her face an unmoving mask of resignation. She wasn't reaching out to save me. She was watching me reach the threshold. She had seen this cycle before, perhaps a dozen times, and she knew that to touch me now was to be pulled into the vacuum of my own vanishing identity. "Nurse," I whispered, my voice sounding tinny and distant, as if piped in from a radio left out in the rain. She turned her head, but her eyes were closed. She wouldn't witness the final surrender. She couldn't afford to. I looked back at the mirror. The Elias on the other side reached out, his fingers passing through the glass as if it were water. He grabbed my lapels, his grip ice cold, smelling of the antiseptic and rot that defined Blackwood's soul. He pulled. I didn't resist. I found to my ultimate horror that I wanted to let go. The weight of the world outside, the credentials, the logic, the crippling loneliness of being an individual was a burden too great to carry in a place where only the collective mattered. As he pulled me forward, the world turned inside out. The screaming of the patients reached a crescendo, a screech of grinding metal and weeping wood, and then, abruptly, it stopped. Total, absolute silence descended. I was standing in the circle now, not in the room I had entered, but in the dark, damp basement where the shadows were long and the air was thin. I was sitting on a hard wooden chair, my back straight, my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I felt the familiar, heavy weight of the asylum's presence pressing into my skull, rearranging my memories, filing them away into the infinite ledger of the lost. Beside me there were others. Thorne sat at the head of the circle, his notebook open, his pen poised. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. I knew exactly what he was writing. He was writing the next intake form. He was writing the story of a man who had arrived at Blackwood, convinced of his own brilliance, only to find that brilliance was the very fuel the ward required to keep its lights flickering in the dark. I felt a serene, hollow joy. I looked at the patient to my left, a man whose face had been scrubbed clean by time, and I saw a fragment of my own childhood, a summer afternoon I had long ago forgotten. I looked to my right, at the woman who never sleeps, and I saw the night I first doubted my own sanity. I wasn't just me anymore. I was the sum of everyone who had been discarded here. I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. It felt natural, fluid, and terribly inevitable. I opened my eyes, or rather, I allowed the collective eyes of the ward to open through me, and I looked at the empty chair across the circle. I waited. I knew someone would be walking through the door soon. I could hear their footsteps in the hallway, the hesitant, arrogant clip of new heels on old tile. They would be bright and full of science, and utterly convinced that they were in control. I leaned forward, my posture mirroring Thorne's, my fingers tracing the edge of my chair. The cycle was a closed loop, and we were the threads that kept it stitched tight. I began to hum, a low, discordant note that vibrated through the floorboards, a warning wrapped in a lullaby. The door handle turned. The light from the hallway bled into our darkness, a harsh, invasive yellow. "Dr. Vance?" A voice called out from the threshold, young, hopeful, and painfully loud. I didn't answer. I just smiled, a vacant, knowing expression that felt like coming home. I watched the shadow of the newcomer stretch long and thin across the floor, reaching out toward the circle. We waited in the silence, a gathering of souls so profoundly lost that we had finally become the architecture of the place that had consumed us. The intake had begun again, and this time, I was the one holding the pen. Your story ends here. The nightmare doesn't. If you want more terrifying tales, like, comment, and subscribe to Dr. Never Sleeps. The lights will go out, the silence will return, and when it does, Listen carefully. Another story is about to begin.